So welcome everybody to the 2017 Sacred Wheel Speaker Series. So each month of this year, I'm going to be talking to a new speaker about the theme of how we can create a world of peace, justice, beauty, and enchantment. And this month, for the month of February, I'm so excited to be joined by Vanessa Couto, who is an astrologer. And Vanessa, of course, I unmuted the dog. I'm going to unmute you and let you introduce yourself. Welcome, Vanessa.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Alice. This is great. So I'm Vanessa Couto. I'm an astrological coach and artist, and I'm based here in Portland, Oregon. And really, the way I like to work with astrology is weaving storytelling and psychology, especially Jungian depth psychology. That tends to be how I work with astrology, helping us to see the patterns that are unfolding in our lives and in the world around us.
Yeah, which is a big subject right now.
A big subject, yeah.
So give us an idea. I invited Vanessa on so that we could all have an idea of what the first half of 2017 looks like. We're going to have another astrologer join us the second half of 2017, but we like to talk about in the Wheel of the Year how the year's divided up between the light half and the dark half. We're just entering the light half now, so we've just celebrated Imbolc. And I'd love for you, Vanessa, to give us an idea of what this first half of the year looks like. What can we expect? What are the broad sort of astrological events that are happening?
So I'm just going to share a screen for, like I told you, a presentation I did. Can you see it?
I can.
All right. So this year, really 2017, is in many ways, I feel like it's definitely a continuation of all the awakening that's got stirred up in 2016. And so in many ways, I think it's a year where we're making omelets. We're breaking the eggs to make the omelets. And I think some of the questions that we can ponder about 2017, and particularly the first half, but I think it will be played out all the way through the end of summer, is that it's questions like, where are we restless in our lives? You know, what change do we need to make to feel a bit more authentic? And perhaps especially the areas in your life where you're feeling kind of dormant and you need a bit of change, some sort of open the window, some clean, fresh air coming in. And it does feel to me that 2017 is definitely the year where we're getting out of our comfort zone. And so some of us are going in, kicking and screaming. Others are going, yay, this is change. I'm joining the fray. But in many ways, I feel 2017 is the breakthrough year in the sense that however do you experience breakthrough? How do you journey through that threshold of leaving an old way of life into a new way of life? And we're definitely seeing this being played out collectively. It's really on the news, right?
Yeah.
And so the main planets that I looked into, how are they dancing, right, in the heavens, is definitely Jupiter and Uranus. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Uranus and Saturn as well. And then also Saturn is finishing up his stay in Sagittarius, which he will only leave at the end of the year. So pretty much for the entire year, Saturn is still in Sagittarius. So all Sagittarius out there and Geminis and Pisces and Virgos are feeling it for sure. We also have Jupiter and Pluto, and we have also Jupiter and Saturn. And towards the end of the year, we're going to have Jupiter moving from Libra into Scorpio. But for most of the year, it's in Libra, which raises a lot of stuff around justice and equality and relationship, and definitely the women's march all around that. And then at the very end of the year, you have Jupiter and Neptune coming together. But if you know a little bit of, Greek mythology and the background of these planets, you have in many ways all the sort of very masculine father-like planets playing out. In some ways too, I felt that this year, 2017, I feel like a lot of father issue being played out. And we can extrapolate father here, not just to be our biological father, but I do think it has to do with the patriarchy, the father, And so we have, so let's see, Jupiter and Uranus, really, this is where I feel the signature of the breakthroughs, the revolutions, and And it kind of started already towards the end of 2016. And aren't we seeing it, right? The marches, people out there. The other element of Jupiter and Uranus, whenever they come together in any sort of relationship, there are many also breakthroughs in technology, in philosophy, in science, in literature. So I think in some ways, especially here in the US, but even in Europe, you're in the news, the politics, but perhaps some of the breakthroughs in science and philosophy are kind of in the background. But it's a shakeup, really, because in many ways, Jupiter expands the energy of Uranus. Now, generally, Uranus in astrology has to do a lot with the breakthrough, the revolution, the shaking up what is dormant. That's what I meant in the beginning by saying what is dormant, what it needs to be shaken up. Usually when somebody's going through a big Uranus transit, I tell clients that it's a bit like you come home and all your furniture is on the ceiling and you just don't know what happened. It's so it feels very sudden. It feels sudden if you're not paying attention to the sort of the nudges. And so in some ways we can see this collectively that everybody's really nudged out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Even if you're not watching the news, if you're avoiding it, you still pick up that vibe, right? You're being like, oh, this just feels so prickly.
Yeah. And I think even those of us that were paying attention to the nudges, it still felt sudden.
Very sudden.
We knew it was coming, but we weren't prepared for how it was going to feel. I mean, at least I know personally, even every step of the way, every time there's a new, the inauguration or something new happens, I'm surprised at how it feels.
Yes. And in some ways, it's so interesting, too, that I was watching SNL this weekend, and one of the skits, she was playing the judge, and she says, would you just please take a day off?
Yeah.
Just so I don't wake up like...
Yeah.
And that in some ways can be the Uranian energies, like this barrage just coming, it's very electric. But you also have Jupiter on the other end of the spectrum, journeying through Libra, and so bringing in a lot of the issues around justice. Jupiter does well in Libra. Libra has to do with not just relationships, but justice and equality. So Jupiter is expanding on that, right? So we are seeing the mass of people, right? Everything massive. And so some of the times that they will be really activated in the skies, and they're dancing on this axis of Aries and Libra. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So they kind of oppose each other, sort of like a seesaw effect, right? One is on one side, the other is on the other side. So they're on the seesaw swinging. And the first hit, it's a bit like a shock and awe of the transit. And so, but in astrology, things don't necessarily happen on the day of,
Right.
It's a bit like the train. You can hear it coming, you can hear it leaving. So definitely in January, weren't we shocked and awed? And then in March 2nd, they do it again, but it's a more, especially because Jupiter is going to be retrograde, so doing all that sort of review, retreating, going inward, it's a moment for us to perhaps take a bit of going deeper and being more aware of what's happening. So it's after the shock, we're like, okay, we've just been hit beside the head. What do we do now? Really, how do we really organize our forces? And then towards September, they do it again, but it's more of an integration. So I feel like this full year, this dance between Jupiter and Uranus is going to be played out.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because both of these, just to bring in the wheel of the year a little bit, both of these are falling right around the equinoxes. So as we're doing the equinox journey and going through the equinox gate, this idea of awareness and then integration is going to be coming through. And that I actually feel like that dovetails really perfectly with the energy of both equinoxes, which really is a little bit more still, a little bit more balanced, a little bit less sort of upheaval.
And the equinox is originally Aries and Libra. It's those axes, right? It's that axis, sorry. So in some ways, we are talking about those two. And when you think about Aries, and I'll go a little bit deeper into Aries because Venus will be spending more time in Aries in this first half of the year. So I think this first half of the year, for me personally, I think it's really well marked by Venus in the background. So I've been thinking about this sort of as I just said, these sort of archetypes are very masculine in their energy. But then we have Venus, sort of the very feminine energy, going into Aries. So I think it's a real bringing of that balance of like, how can we bring in the feminine energy? But how can we take being active, taking action with passion, right? But I'll go more in depth with Venus when we get there.
Okay.
So Jupiter, Uranus, I do feel it's the major backdrop of the year. This is where I think the breakthrough is. And so if you look at your own birth chart and you look at degrees between 20 to 27 in your chart where you have Aries and Libra, that's where that dance is happening. That's the area of your life that perhaps you're being kind of awakened, kind of like shaken to be like, what is dormant? How can I, bring in some fresh air? And also too, not just politically, but Uranus is about changing your life's philosophy, especially bringing in Jupiter. So in some ways, it's not business as usual. All of last year, I kept saying in my newsletter that we're not in Kansas anymore. Well, we're not in Kansas. We have, the twister has come already. So in some ways, too, one way that we can engage with this energy, if not politically, although I'm a firm believer that inner work is also political work, is that how can we engage our curiosity? What are we curious about? What can we study that will help us expand our philosophy of life? I like this image because it seems like the glass wasn't big enough to fit the earth, to be expanding. Now, the other guy that I think is always a big player, I think, is Saturn, because Saturn is going to be dancing with Uranus, dancing with Jupiter. And with Saturn in Sagittarius, since it's been last year and all of 2015, it has really been about us reviewing, in many ways, our philosophy, our worldview, our motto in life. But in some ways, it also is playing out in very concrete ways. And when we talk about Saturn, it's always very concrete. It's playing out in the news. We see it all the time now because Saturn, actually Sagittarius, has to do with the publishing world, the news. So there we have it. And all of last year, we had Saturn dancing with Neptune. And so now it's the explosion of the fake news, the illusion, what is true, what is not. And Sagittarius is a sign that is really concerned with what is the truth? What is the truth? And so we still have that theme going on. And I think also too with Saturn, because Saturn makes things concrete, it makes things take shape in the physical world. We are really definitely on that collective threshold about to burst through. So when Saturn comes around, it's also a definite time for endings and beginnings. I always think of Saturn as sort of the stern teacher that tells you got to bring me the homework. There's no sense in telling me that the dog ate it. It's very exacting. But also in some ways, because it's in Sagittarius, I think some of the ideas that we thought that would never happen, that's heresy. Well, it could be happening. It could become the status quo in both ways, good or bad. Right. Yeah. So we're looking at the news and we're like, I can't believe that was even uttered. Right. So that's, I think, in many ways, the explosion of the whole issue around the news and what is truth.
So does that mean we might see an end to some of the sway that fake news has been holding on us, or is it just another explosion of this struggle between truth and illusion?
I think the theme of that is going to stay throughout the year because the real dance started last year. But like I said, the way the planets dance together, it kind of initiates and then it plays out and then we integrate. So I think this is the year where the news definitely will be coming under fire. And in our own personal lives, we're also going to be questioning that, right? What is the truth? And what is my truth? And how do I want to go after that?
Okay.
And so that could bring in changes. This is sort of my thinking. It could bring in changes on how the news is given. What is the news? I'm afraid of a little bit of censorship coming around. This is perhaps a bit of my own fear, because Saturn has to do with the whole, we're going to stop this, putting up walls. Look at even that. We have the wall against foreigners. Very Saturn in Sagittarius, because Sagittarius is about the foreigner. It's about the other, especially the other from a different religion, from a different philosophy. So a lot of it with Saturn, especially in relationship to Uranus, is being played out in December, then in May 19th, and then towards the end of the year. And then in December, it goes into Capricorn, just on the edge of the winter solstice.
Okay.
And so in some ways, once Saturn arrives in Capricorn, he is in his own home turf, which should be interesting to watch, because that's a dance that's going to play out to 2018 through 2020. And so I feel like when Uranus and Saturn come together, it is about giving birth to that intuitive idea. So that's where I think if there's a revolution, if there's a creation, even if we bring in ourselves, we have an intuitive idea, this is the year where we're going to feel really itchy to get it to materialize. So you can imagine Saturn as a sort of midwife to these ideas.
I like that idea.
It gives it shape.
I think all of us are feeling that kind of revolutionary push right now. Like, we are really itchy for some birth to happen, some change.
Yeah. And in some ways, even, they've talked about this a lot about the election, right? People want to change. Now that they voted for that kind of change, it's still a bit shocking. But in some ways, Saturn is also, it can be on one aspect, bringing in the tradition back. So it made sense to say, make America great again. That perspective, right? Let's go back to the good old days, the fantasy of that. And then we have Jupiter and Pluto dance. They've been dancing since November of last year, then again in March and August. And they're going between Libra and Capricorn. So then you have this idea of justice and establishment.
Right.
We have women in the government, relationships and power. Capricorn, Pluto and Capricorn has been there for quite a while. It's been there since 2008. And we can see how this has a lot to do with the banks, the money, the way things are spent. But in our own personal life, I believe that it has to do with the dance between relationship, wanting to compromise, wanting to be on equal footing. But Capricorn, in a sense, to be independent, to be the authority of your own life. So I think that's kind of the power dance between these two throughout the year. And also in some ways too, when you're bringing in Jupiter and Pluto, you're starting to talk about the issue of God and belief systems too. So again, we're having that as well. And personally, I think it has to do with perhaps the country, and we're not going to get into the astrology of the United States chart, let's say, it's beyond that, but in some ways, collectively, we're questioning what is our image of God, of divinity, of our belief system. And I think it's more than just spiritually. It has to do with, if you think about even in our money, the dollar bill, we have in God we trust, in the dollar bill. There, I think, is that idea of perhaps collectively we believe that capitalism is a kind of religion. We should never question it. Right? So I'm getting out there.
Is that questioning going to start coming in? Is that what we're seeing? More of those questions might begin to...
More. And people, I think now, even if people before were talking just amongst their friends, now it's really getting out there, I think. I think it started last year, people vocalizing that more and more. But 2017 does have this, it feels this energy of where we are now being called to take sides. Even though we're also trying to establish some line of communication to the other side, we are kind of perhaps becoming a little bit more entrenched as well. This is the idea. But it has a lot to do with these belief systems and the power behind them, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have, of course, Jupiter and Saturn playing together. And in some ways, it kind of cushions the idea again of we are asking the why questions around justice, truth, and belief. What's the relationship? That's Jupiter and Libra asking, what is the real relationship around these? And hopefully, especially because around Saturn, we have a return of some common sense, but it doesn't seem like we're there yet. But in some ways, too, we can see this being played out in more and more the idea of makes me think of tiny homes and minimalism. Let's sort of have less, be more simple. Let's get down to the truth of the matter instead of having all these ornaments around us. So in some ways, it can bring that sense of simplicity.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, because of Saturn and Jupiter, usually these two, when they dance together, Jupiter tends to expand and Saturn tends to contract.
Mm-hmm.
So if they can work together, it's about having enterprise, but being responsible.
Mm-hmm.
So with Libra and Sagittarius, I think it's about how can we welcome perhaps different ideas, that's the Sagittarius element, and establish a relationship with different philosophies, even when they're like absolutely different from what we believe. How can we engage with that? So I think collectively we're definitely dancing with that.
Yeah, that would be a nice question to see us all address.
Yeah, how do we do it?
Yeah.
Personally, I think that's where I've been reflecting a lot about this since last year, that the inner work is really political work, because your inner work has definitely collective repercussions, way beyond your family and friends. So
I see a lot of racial justice work happening here too, especially around white privilege, like us asking the hard questions of how can we integrate this into ourselves and how can we take responsibility for this force, rather than just saying, racial justice is an issue for people of color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just yesterday, I watched the third episode of a BBC documentary about their biggest historical fibs. And so the historian goes into different key moments in British history and really goes deep in fleshing out who really told the story. What was the propaganda behind it? And what lies were created out of that? And in the end, she says, don't believe what I'm saying. A few years from now, somebody else is going to retell the same story. Yeah. And I can see this being played out as every day on the news, right? We're having to have lists of which newspapers can we sort of trust or not trust according to the way they're framing things. So I think the idea that, and that's why I think it's causing so much social anxiety, is because everything has moved, has shifted, and we don't know we can't put our hats on the same place as we did before.
Yeah.
So I think now the other bigger player, especially for this first semester, is Venus. Mm-hmm. As she goes retrograde. She doesn't go retrograde every year. And so with her, she starts, because Venus has a lot to say about value. Where do we place our value? It is about relationships, but relationship, when you think about it, is not just one-on-one. It is the relationship we have with things and ideas, and has a lot to do with value. You're going to spend more time with people you value, right? Mm-hmm. If you're in love early days in a relationship, you tend to spend all your time. So you can see that Venus brings in questions around, is it worth it? Mm-hmm. Is this that I've been engaged with, is it worth it? Should I, stick with it? So when a planet goes retrograde, is definitely a time to review these things. Mm-hmm. And so the key words around this time of the year is about perception and the projection we carry in our relationship. So here I really invite people to go beyond just intimate relationships or romantic relationships. It's the relationship we have with work, we have with time, we have with ourselves, all of that. Mm-hmm. So that's Venus. So in many ways, Venus, a bit like Mercury, these two, because they're ever so close to the sun, and even in mythology, they're kind of always around each other. They're in many ways sort of a civilizing element in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, they're the gateway, especially Venus, to between our inner and outer worlds, right? That's the idea of the relationship. So she starts her retrograde time on March 4th in Aries. She's already in Aries. And then on March 25th, she comes together with the sun. And when Venus comes together with the sun during her retrograde phase, a little bit like a new moon. And so in some ways, you're really resetting the clock of your relationships, and which sets the tone for the next pretty much 18 months.
Mm-hmm. And
then she starts to go direct on April 15th.
Mm-hmm.
So she dips back into Pisces, but most of the time she's in Aries.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to look around your chart to see where do you have Aries, Pisces, and these are the areas that really can be activated. That sort of. So again, you can see Aries is involved.
Mm-hmm.
And in the midst,
March is going to be big. It seems like we had that other event on March 2nd and March 4th, and then right into the equinox, Venus and the sun coming together, which is also just this beautiful idea of the balance of dark and light, feminine and masculine, and then stationing direct on the 15th. So March into April is kind of be a
big times.
Yeah.
And also, actually, the end of February, on February 26th, we have a solar eclipse coming up.
Okay.
And it's also going to be, it's going to be in Pisces, but on the day of the eclipse, Mars and Uranus will be coming together. So whatever Mars touches is a bit like a trigger. And when it touches Uranus, a bit like sticking your finger into the electric socket. So again, we are as we speak in the eclipse season, which is, well, all bets are off. It's a wild card, right? And so in the midst of that, that's at the end of February. And then you get March, Venus goes retrograde. While she's retrograde, especially in April, Mercury will go retrograde as well.
Okay.
It's like, review time, anybody?
Okay.
So there's something about that's interesting, I think, with Venus being retrograde, especially in Aries, is not only are our relationships called up for review, but I do think it fits the archetype really well of the sort of the new idea of, it's not so new, but it's becoming, I feel like, more and more prominent, the sort of the love warrior, standing up for love, as if love is a verb, love is action, love is not passive anymore. Venus traditionally in Aries, she's not in her most comfortable place. It's a fire sign. So again, there's the other element too. Aries is very activated. It's just a very fiery sort of year. And so with Venus in Aries, I think it brings in all these images of the warrior goddess. When she rises after her union with the sun, she rises as the morning star. And for the ancients, that was the warrior goddess. That was the warrior side of Venus. So personally, I would hope that what started with the Women's March takes even better shape and more of a sort of a real goal and objective to something that's more disciplined. With my friends and clients, I've been talking, especially since last year, that I feel like we're coming to a time where we're needing to really welcome to the table the quote unquote so-called the dark goddesses.
Yep.
The sort of the airy-fairy stuff is not going to cut it anymore. They're welcome, but now we got to welcome the other ones. And so I feel like with Venus in Aries, especially for us women, even if you don't have a lot of planets in Aries, let's say, it really calls us to review the way we take action in the world, the way we assert ourselves in the world. Aries is a sign and an archetype that speaks to this ability to be like, no, I'm doing it. I'm taking action. And it's interesting that Venus dips back into Pisces. And I think Pisces brings in this sort of energy that, oh yes, we need to release. Perhaps what we're releasing or reviewing as she's doing this in her retrograde is how are we playing out the victim card?
Yeah.
The sort of self-sacrifice, the martyr, and I think Aries is very much not that kind of energy. It's very like, no, we're going for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think things that are initiated, relationships that are initiated while Venus is, let's say, retrograde, they will come up for review, or they may sort of stall. But the other element that's very symbolic for Venus is that her retrograde phase takes 40 days,
Mm-hmm.
give or take. And we know this even from the Bible, right? Jesus goes to the desert for 40 days. There's something about 40 days.
Yeah.
It calls up to us going inward, reflecting on our values. Where do we place our affections? What gives us joy? What gives us pleasure? And money. It translates to all of that, pleasure in relationship to money. So in some ways, perhaps one way to honor her retrograde phase is that for 40 days we may take up a practice of, it could be around your creativity, could be around your relationships, could be around you exploring your own feminine, all the feminine sides of yourself. You can get really creative with that, with retrograde.
And that would start on the 4th, that 40-day period?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In many ways, she's already kind of slowing down, as we say, but March 4th is when she's technically shifts. And also retrogrades are about perception. Planets don't really move backwards. From our perspective, they do.
Yeah.
So it's about perception. And I think that for those who are into, having a ritual, being creative with that, I'll definitely do something around March 25th.
Okay.
The whole energy of Sun and Venus coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those are great times to do that. And on here too, I have just the dates of all the eclipses of the year. And we just had one, the lunar eclipse last Friday. And then we have the one on the 26th, which is in Pisces. So it's in many ways releasing, I think, a lot of the, I really feel like with the energies of Aries and Pisces about releasing the victimness, the sort of the martyr, the redeemer, savior complex that we may carry ourselves. And then now later on in the year, we're going to have August. So February is an eclipse kind of month. And then August, again, is the other eclipse. Just a side note, your other astrology will talk about August, but the solar eclipse on the 21st in August is a big one because it will cross the United States.
Yeah, let's talk about that actually.
That one is pretty close here in Oregon. It starts around here, just south of Portland. But and it also hits it hits the chart of Trump. And usually when an eclipse happens in a country, astrologers tend to look to the leader of the country because how it relates to the leader, right?
Yeah.
So that would be interesting because, again, it's towards the end of Leo. And I think there's something about being the sovereign, being the leader, but also for us personally will have to do with our sense of creativity and joy. How are we fully expressing ourselves? So it's a pretty heated, I think, of all the eclipses, that's the one that I'm curious to watch what's going to develop.
Interesting.
In the country, for sure. So those are dates to mark your calendar, I think. So then we have Mercury retrograde. For pretty much all of the year, Mercury retrograde is going to be in the earth signs. It's going to dip into the fire signs, but most of it is going to be in the earth signs. So whenever Mercury goes retrograde, which is really about reviewing our perception, reviewing how we communicate and connect with things. When it's in the earth sign, it's about our tangible life. It's the actual things we have, how we're getting results across. So it's about the structure of our lives. The next one starts on April 9th, and it's going to be in Taurus. and it goes all the way to May 3rd. Dips back into Aries. So in some ways, because it's in Taurus, we are kind of collectively reviewing our values, our resources, our material resources. So it goes from us really talking about climate change and how we, dealing with planet Earth, our relationship with Earth, but also what do we have in our bank account? Do we need to buy a new sofa? Like as concrete as it gets, around our sort of material resources.
It's also interesting because there's a big, the Science March on Washington is happening during that retrograde period on Earth Day.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So April 22nd, there's also going to be a big convergence of scientists on Washington around, I think, specifically the climate change issue. Excuse me.
Yeah. So that's really something, right? It's going to be the voice is, and Mercury has a lot to say, especially in your own birth chart, how we integrate and communicate, how do we gather information and how we digest it, right? So there you have the scientists saying, we've collected the data, here it is. But these are some of the dates we've had, one in Capricorn that ended on January 8th. I kind of included that as part of the one in the year, but then Taurus, Aries, right? So interesting that it's going to dip back into Aries in some ways, again, that warrior energy, that sort of pioneering leadership energy. I think also from a personal perspective, with all this Aries fire going on, personally, I think for us, it calls on how can we be leaders? How can we take more of a leadership role in our lives? What is it to be a leader? What is it to be a pioneer or start something? And then later in the year, Mercury goes retrograde in August, September, Virgo, Leo, so putting the house in order. And then at the end of the year, it's going to be in Sagittarius. So again, I think we're reviewing our beliefs in our relationships with the other.
Yeah. And again, I'm seeing that stacking up of March and August, September, that kind of equinox energy. There was a bunch of stuff kind of happening in those months. So it's like if things are going to get grouped together, it's around those times.
Yeah. So that sort of the clusters, right? And also in relationship to, I'm just looking at my notes here, in relationship to Venus, she kind of finishes her shadow period in May. So she's back to, okay. But again, it's a long time to be in Aries, Venus to be in Aries. So people initiating things, initiating relationships.
Yeah.
Whatever that may be.
Yeah.
So something to watch for, definitely.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, and you may not have an answer, and it's okay if you don't, but personally, as an astrologer, where do you see the most hope for us this year? What events or what are you taking hope from?
I think I'm taking hope from the fact that on both sides of the, because it's for everybody, really, if you think it's about taking action. It's really about the time for rehearsal is done.
Yeah.
So I think as much as we may still feel like, no, I got to be in my closet. No, I can't do this. I think all this fire energy to a certain degree is making us very uncomfortable sitting still. So we will have to take some action.
Yeah.
Which to me is like, well, the other side, if you will, if we just use a Star Wars analogy, they're also taking action. So we have to get organized on our side and take action. I kind of see Venus in Aries a little bit like the character from the Star Wars Rogue One,
I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. So, very much the kick-ass kind of heroine. Okay. But I think in some ways that's the plus, that it's really about us taking action. So I see this in the more sort of esoteric communities, sort of in the people who are more into the spirituality, mystics. They're about like, okay, I've done all this inner work in the mystical world. How do I take it out into the world? So I think this is not, and the other time I think personally is that, and I think I've seen this somewhere on Facebook, whereas if if you believe, or if you feel any sort of energetic link to this idea that you were once a witch that got burned, I think every one of them got reborn now, and it's
Right.
about like, we're stepping out.
Yeah. Oof. I just
There's
got
that element.
goosebumps when you said that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I do think, though, however, that it's going to take us some toughening up collectively as well, because in the midst of all this sort of shock and awe, shaking it up, getting it out of the comfort zone, of course, it caused a lot of anxiety and stress. So, of course, we have to take care of ourselves and do self-care, so balance it out. Because the sense I have in all these transformations is because these transformations are really actually beyond even the president that we have now. This is all a preparation in some ways to what's coming in 2020. And so I feel that we really have to sort of exercise our sort of psyche, the muscle of our psyche to run a longer race.
Yeah.
Not just this sort of jerk reaction activism. That's, I think, what the challenge is, because I don't think we remember as well in our generation or culture how to do this. You know, I think we're gonna need to be very creative. And I do like that even the Mercury retrograde, despite those phases sometimes can be very challenging, Mercury always reminds us to engage with the trickster energy. And I think we will need to be more foxy around that trickster energy. And so I think it's going to be lively. But if we have we're very maybe too empathic and just capturing everything, and anything around self-care and proper boundaries, these things are really going to be needed as sort of first aid, if you will.
Yep.
Times.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to open it up to questions from our guests, our audience here. So I do want to give you guys, those of you who joined a little bit late, I want to make sure you know these videos are going to get posted to YouTube publicly. So they will be available to members of the public. So you will want to black out your screen if you don't want to appear your face on the video. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. And you also can type it in chat if you want to be a little bit more anonymous, because I know all my students are here and not everybody will want to be on a YouTube video, but just that's my one caveat. And then do we have any questions for Vanessa? Either folks who want to unmute themselves or type in the chat box, or thoughts or connections you guys drew while we were talking. Just going to give it a second. And while people are thinking if they have any questions to throw in, I guess we already started talking about this a little bit, but my other question for you, Vanessa, would be, so what advice do you have for us in terms of preparing for this year? I think you gave good advice in learning how to be foxy with trickster energy. Learning how to strategize for the long game was good advice. Do you have anything else you would add? Self-care, I heard you talk about. Anything else you want to add in? Advice you have for us?
I really think that shadow dance, shadow work needs to be done, because I think sometimes we look at government and we look at what's happening, and it almost feels like they're aliens who just landed and took over. Some conspiracy theories might say that, but joking aside, I do think that it's a grand opportunity to look at our own selves and see, where are we prejudiced, racist, bigots, where perhaps our own inner Trump resides. And I think this is what we felt that already last year when it was like all over. And in some ways, I think one of the reasons it's so uncomfortable is because as we see these things, even perhaps with less awareness, we know it is our own shadow that's being mirrored back.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in some ways, before we tackle the external, we have to constantly be doing our own inner work in that respect. And for me, one way to do it is through dreams. Observe your dreams, what's showing up. Observe your daydreams, your fantasies, and not just all the sort of fantasy of being by the beach sipping martinis, but the more, perhaps more, even more challenging kind, the nightmarish kind.
Yeah.
I think if we don't digest ourselves that energy, we deal with these archetypes, more likely they will be externalized into events and people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see I feel like a lot of the questions that last year people ask, how did this happen? How did this happen? To me, in many ways, it was like, we didn't deal with our own inner shadow. That's how it's happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's right here.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, I think that's the deeper work. And it won't be just this year. I think that's the long run kind of work.
Yeah.
And it's not as sexy, but it needs to be done. It's a bit like, you got to throw the trash out. You
Mm-hmm.
have to do the cleaning of the house.
Mm-hmm.
So do the cleaning of your own psyche. Work with that. Get creative.
Yeah, that's a very good point and a great reminder. So let's talk a little bit about that then. How can people work with you if they...
You can go to my website, which is vanessacouto.com. That's COUTO. And I have my services there. I work a lot with, I work a lot with women who are really they're either going through a big threshold in their lives, like a very liminal space of like, my old self doesn't quite fit, but the new one isn't quite here yet. Mm-hmm. And I've been working also a lot with women who are just starting or have already started their own business to align their sense of soul purpose and what they're here to do with their business. Yeah. So we do more of a sort of marketing, branding look using astrology with that. I also have a podcast on iTunes. That's Liminal Astro Coaching, where I kind of bring in the astrology and storytelling and psychology. And I also have my coloring books on Amazon. I'll show you one because I think this one is pretty relevant. This is the lunar one for 2017, where for each mandala, I have a mandala for the new moon and the full moon with a description about the energy of that moon and a little sort of journaling prompt. Mm-hmm. I did one for last year and it was really awesome. And then the other one I have is one that's about the sun. So it's about the signs and the planets and how it weaves together. So this is a coloring book / kind of like course book on astrology.
Nice.
That's one thing I believe that's going to be needed is, I think this year is also a call to all the creatives, and however you exercise your creativity, that's going to also be good for not just your self-care, but a way to express your vision into the world.
Yep. Yeah. So last year, some of my students know last year I gifted a lot of my initiates Vanessa's Astrology of Joy coloring book. And I will say I kept one for myself. And just having that, I don't know, would you call it a mandala?
I call them mandalas, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just having that piece of, sometimes there wasn't, I could definitely feel the effects of whatever was happening with the moon. And I didn't really have the time to organize myself into a full ritual working, and just taking some time to sit and reflect and color in that picture actually was a form of therapy for me. So I'm giving a little plug here because I used one last year, and it was really actually a beautiful way to connect with those energies, even if you're not having time to put together a full moon or new moon ritual.
Yeah, and I think it's good. You can take it on the road, right? I like it because coloring for me is my meditation. So it was a natural thing to create. But this time I was even more conscious in creating the mandalas, and I really feel like they capture the energy of the moon. And when you really start following the new moon and the full moon, you can really see the story being weaved throughout the year. Mm-hmm. Because in some ways, because the moon moves so quickly and touches every planet and it goes through every sign, she carries that energy around. She keeps it moving. And so it's that daily rhythm of the moon that helps us really create things in the world.
Yeah.
So the coloring for me is one way to honor that.
Yeah. And I feel like the work that both of us is doing, we're both, it's this astrology, like looking at the large. So what we did is we looked at sort of the overarching patterns of the planets today. And then what we're doing in this class is we're looking at the patterns of our planet. And then the moon is one step. I feel like if you were going to make a little pie chart, you know, or a sort of family tree, the moon would be the next layer of micro patterns within the year. So I feel like this work that both of us are doing, and lots of other people, not just the two of us, it's the work of reweaving those patterns and reweaving humanity into those patterns, because we have drifted away from this idea that we are somehow in the fabric of these patterns. And I feel like this major piece of bringing that back, even if like that's a piece, I don't know, of like that warrior goddess rising, of that Venus energy coming back in, is that recognition of, oh yes, I am a piece of larger patterns, and how can I then reweave my life back into them?
And that's really interesting you're saying that, because in my son's heroic journey coloring book, I bring in something that people often don't think about. Astrology is actually very much tied to the seasons.
Yeah.
You know, the sun the whole journey starts with Aries equinox, right?
Yeah.
It really weaves in the seasons in the northern hemisphere, and that's where it was born. So then it goes with all that. So when you look at the dance of the planets, yes, you're getting that sort of bigger, broad brushstroke of what's happening, right? What's the dance? But I find that even for people who never had their chart done, but if they just follow the signs month by month and just tap into the archetypes of that sign, it helps you get into the flow of the year. And then when you get into the flow of the moon, from new to full and, you know, back again, you get into a more sort of a micro. So the moon's journey in some ways is the micro journey of the sun.
Yeah.
It brings in a more natural rhythm. And that was why I call it the astrology of joy, because I feel that when you know your chart and you get to, and it's like an exploration that seems to never end, you know, even my own chart, I'm constantly learning new things about it. But when you get to that, to know your chart, and you get into to acknowledge and follow your own natural rhythm, there's joy in that. And so I think part of the craziness of the world we live in is that because we're so out of sync with our own rhythms, everything's fast.
Yep. So I'm not seeing any questions. So I want to, maybe we'll wrap up, and I just want to say thanks for joining us. I'm going to take a second to just give us a little outro, and then I'm going to turn off the recording and we can take a second to say goodbye to everybody. So thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us.
Thank you, Allison, for inviting me. It's always fun.
Yeah. And you can learn more about Vanessa it's vanessacouto.com.
Yeah.
And I'm going to post a link to that when I do post the video publicly. Again, I'm Allison Carr, and I want to thank you for joining us for the Sacred Wheel Speaker Series. If you want to find out more about the speakers I'm having this year and get announcements about when the next video is posted right to your inbox, you can sign up at my website, which is allisoncarr.com. And I'm going to put a link when I post the video and the audio for this also. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next month, where we're going to be talking to Dawn Gibson about being in the body and body-centered practices, and specifically around trauma. So thank you.